Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Purple State of Mind podcast. My name is Siddharth,
I'm Ishan.
and today we're going to be talking about three major conflicts that have been ongoing or have originated during the second Trump administration. The first of which will be kind of the diplomatic crisis surrounding Greenland, and we're going to be talking a little bit more about American leaders at the Munich Security Conference and how they tried to appeal to European leaders about their cooperation. Then we're going to move on to Ukraine and Russia, the ongoing Ukraine and Russia conflict, which has been going on for, I believe, 4 years now. And the third we're going to be talking about will be the Trump administration's policy towards Iran and kind of the looming threat of kinetic action in the region. So, starting with Greenland, the first thing I'm going to say is at the Munich Security Conference, I think we saw kind of a pivot where you see a little bit more of a softer approach from the Trump administration with diplomacy with Europe, rather than the president going out and kind of saying, you guys, you submit to me, you do what I say. If we want Greenland, we're going to get Greenland. I guess more so we're seeing Marco Rubio, especially, kind of go out there and try to tell Europe that they do have a plan and they do have an idea and there's something that they're trying to, they're trying to justify something. So, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that we saw this pivot, but also going into Munich, a lot of the European countries, that was their primary focus. It was on the relations between the US and Denmark, it was on those relations specifically regarding Greenland. But I think it's also just worth noting that the US has lost a lot of its moral compass through the Trump administration. We constantly criticize Russia for invading Ukraine, and then we go and threaten to invade or take over or annex, whatever. Greenland, we say the same about China and Taiwan, which we'll get to later when it comes to AOC's response to that. But overall, I just think it's despicable. It's truly despicable, the policy towards Greenland, and we still really haven't gotten a real rationale as to why it's a necessary annexation for the U.S. I get he's put out this idea that it's for our security, but it's still a part of NATO at the end of the day. So if Russia or China were to do anything there, it's still a part of our probably one of the best alliances in modern history.
Yeah, well, I guess my view towards Greenland being, I guess, American land. Well, first thing is I don't think the approach is correct whatsoever. I think that the aggression shown by the Trump administration is misplaced. I think that it's obviously reckless. You've kind of seen a straightening of relations between America and Europe, which I think some of us expected with the Trump administration or with Trump being elected in 2024. But I mean, I personally believe by strain, I thought that we would be more demanding in a sense that we want them to be more like, I guess, fending for themselves rather than us having to put more emphasis on Europe's defense. However, we're seeing kind of more of a flip. We're seeing the United States, I guess, threatening Europe to the point where Europe is seeing that they, I guess, have to cooperate more. But when it comes to Greenland itself, I guess the importance for the United States is, I understand that it'd definitely be helpful to have. We already have military presence there with the how do you say it, Patuffik, something like that, the space base, which is in Greenland. However, I mean, I think at any point we can probably negotiate to put more technology there if we really want, or station more men. We have, or we had, well-established diplomatic channels between American officials and Danish officials, even, or within NATO. It can be brought up at so many different places. But I guess the rationale they're trying to give is that Denmark's not doing enough to defend itself, so how can we expect them to defend Denmark or Greenland if it came to it? But again, I think that's completely misplaced, and it really does. What's the word? It really does justify some speculation from European leaders about their cooperation with the United States and if they should divest and look at other partners. However, I'm going to be straightforward and say that it would not be in Europe's best interest to divest from the United States, because I don't think there is a better ally for Europe than the United States, and I don't think there's a better ally for the United States than Europe. Conditional on the basis that Europe does do enough to defend itself, where an alliance kind of turns into something that all the nations, it's a bunch of nations that are ready and stable and capable of defending themselves, working together to defend a common goal.
Yeah, I agree with you on portions of what you said. But I also think that at the end of the day, Europe needs to kind of have that awakening and realize that, yes, the U.S., and we obviously saw Gavin Newsom and Gretchen Whitmer really try and push this agenda onto them and show them that Trump is for 4 years. Trump is not for the rest of American history. So so Europe basically should keep their stake in the U.S. But if you're Europe right now, how do you go into this relationship with the U.S. knowing that in any 4 years you could have a president who completely cuts ties with Europe and tries to keep this dependency going? And so, no, I do think that we should be great allies with them. But purely from a European sense, I don't understand how you could keep the same level of relations that you had prior to Trump. And we've seen Mark Carney talk a lot about this, the Canadian Prime Minister. And I think in part he's right. And he did also mention, kind of going into his speech now, at the prior conference, the Davos conference, he really touched upon the end of a rules-based world order. And AOC actually brought up a good point. That ended a while ago. I view it, at least, as that ended a while ago when the U.S. continued to fund a genocide in Israel and Palestine. But I guess what I'm kind of playing at here is, if Europe actually wants to have a secure and long-standing relationship with the U.S., it needs to be on different terms than it was under Joe Biden, under Barack Obama. It needs to be under terms in which the two sides are at least somewhat equal. And I think that that's a big flaw of what Trump has done so far, because if you're Americans, as we are, and what we want is we want Europe to have that dependency on us because it's better for us overall. And so I think that that's a big problem and something that hopefully a 2028 contender is able to address, but I'm just not sure if the relationship is there. It's like broken glass, and you can never put it back together.
Well, if we're talking about a rules-based global order, first of all, I thought that the quote-unquote rules-based global order was redundant in a sense, because when you want to have something like that, when you want to have these international institutions that are able to dictate what so many countries do, first of all, there can't be a veto power. That completely defeats the purpose of having an international organization where they kind of cooperate on what's best for them, or they try to come to a majority decision, I guess. However, the UN, and I think you'll agree with me on this, on all three of the conflicts that we've listed, plus the war in Gaza, the UN has done nothing but put forward strongly written resolutions or sending observers to go, take notes about what's going on. Even with the Iran nuclear program, they sent their observers, or quote-unquote watchdogs, but you didn't really see an aggressive action to enforce the resolutions that they've come up with. Even with the Board of Peace, we're seeing how the resolution approved, I think it was 2803, United Nations Security Council 2803, they specifically confined the Board of Peace's jurisdiction to Gaza. However, in the Board of Peace's charter, Gaza is not mentioned whatsoever. So already that order was kind of weak, and it's time that nations start to act in their own national interest. And I guess with Europe, to refine what I'm saying, what I mean by it's not in their best interest to divest, I guess I was kind of speaking in a more blunt, straightforward tone. What I mean is to divest entirely, or to divest a majority of what they're doing. What would be better for Europe, I think, is so it's weird for me to say. I mean, being someone that's usually in support of, I guess, free trade and the free market, I think it's better for Europe to strengthen itself internally. So focus on their own domestic production and domestic strength. Of course, specialization, trading, once you specialize, what's best for you. But I think that it's best for them to develop themselves or develop their nations to the point where they can actually bring themselves to being equal with the United States. So to counter what you're saying about how, or I guess agreeing with you, but also adding on to it, Europe should try to establish new terms with the United States to where they're equals. again, conditional that Europe becomes equal to the United States in terms of it doesn't have to be military power, but in terms of economic strength, in terms of technology, internal development. Like Germany, for example, has some of the best medical research in the world, some of the best scientific research in the world. They should take advantage of that, and they should really specialize in that. And then additionally, um, within each individual nation, I guess strengthening themselves and additionally working together with each other in the European Union and etc. and establishing their own trade connections, which I believe they have usually with the EU. But you're seeing the EU kind of already diversify their trade portfolio. Uh, I don't know if they've signed a paper deal. I don't know if there's details out, but they've agreed to a huge trade deal with India. I know that they're exploring in Africa and other places for some of their materials, some of their minerals, things like that. They're exploring new trade deals, and that's something that's beneficial for them. And at the end of the day, it's beneficial for us as well because I don't think it's a good thing to have anybody dependent on us because it would be different if it was a nation that was really naturally rich, I guess, or they had a lot of resources that we needed and they were dependent on us. However, with Europe, I think that having Europe be stronger and not as dependent on us will be beneficial because I think we can divert some of the attention we give to Europe back to ourselves.
Fair enough, but I do think that a lot of the attention that we give to Europe is a direct. It also in some ways benefits the American people because, as I said, that dependency keeps us on more of an elevated surface when it comes to the global stage, and that's something that's good for us overall, and it's something that I don't know. I guess an American first mindset, you would want that as well. But I want to kind of tie back to what you said at the beginning there about the UN and its lack of enforcement power. I think that is a problem. The UN is, on paper, it sounds nice, but in practicality, it really does not serve a true purpose at this point. Because if you're not able to actually enforce anything, what exactly is your point? What exactly is the purpose? To bring a bunch of countries together to sit in the same room? I mean, we can do that. We can do that regardless. I feel like the UN needs some serious reworking, or there needs to be some type of global channels that allow this to happen. And if we look at the Board of Peace, you're right, it's a prime example of the way that the UN has kind of failed us because Donald Trump was able to get this 2-year agreement from the UN to create his Board of Peace, and then he appointed himself chairman for life and really has no oversight. So I'm not sure what the end goal is here for Trump, but and let me just clarify this. He's chairman for life, meaning Donald Trump is chairman for life.
Yeah, not the U.S.
not
president.
the president of the United States. The United States president has the same power there as any other country that buys in. And also, you, the American taxpayer, is paying $10 billion for entry into this Board of Peace that is for Donald Trump to have his own governing power, I guess, because maybe he wants to be president of the world since president of the United States is not enough. So anyway, my point overall, though, is that the UN really needs some type of readjustment, realigning to actually achieve its purpose, because if you list out a bunch of human rights abuses but don't actually do anything about it or don't actually allow things to be done, then you're pointless.
Yeah, I think part of that, I mean, I feel like I want to be more more vocal on this as time goes on. The United Nations Human Rights Council has Qatar on it, a nation which essentially employs slavery in their construction. You have Ethiopia, where there's a massive conflict. Some may call it a genocide of the Tigray people, or I don't know how to pronounce it, Tigray. You have, I mean, it's a rotating thing. You have so many nations that do not have the best human rights record themselves. And it kind of, again, it begs the question, what really is the rationale for having such a big global institution that doesn't necessarily do its job? Yet, I guess, moving on from that, what I kind of tried to establish from Marco Rubio's speech, moving into that a little bit, is we're at a disadvantage when there's an international body that tries to enforce rules and only some nations follow it. Because like our adversaries, Russia and China, they're obvious. We don't know what's even going on in their you know internally. Who knows if they're following all of these international laws we've set, and it kind of puts us at a disadvantage. I'm not saying that we should break these laws while they're there. I mean, but what I'm saying is our national sovereignty shouldn't be superseded by a global body that doesn't actually put forward results apart from paper. And I really think the what's going on in Gaza is a really big teller of that. And then additionally, with what's going on in Iran and what's going on with the protesters, I think that's also another telling thing that the Human Rights Council barely spoke up until recently. I don't remember exactly who it is. I don't remember what country she's from. But there is a UN human rights or a UN ambassador, somebody who's involved with the UN, who's finally been condemned for, I guess, denying what's going on to the protesters in Iran. So I guess kind of going back to the United States and Europe situation, with these international bodies, moving, I guess, from these big bodies that are hard to enforce, I think what would be a better approach is more multilateralism and plurilateralism where it's needed. Because if we're going to talk about, let's say we're gonna talk about a naval conflict going on in the Indian Ocean, I don't necessarily think that Paraguay should be involved in that conversation. You know what I mean? So
Yeah,
the
yeah, that makes
nations,
sense.
the nations that are actually involved in what's going on. So let's say we're talking about the South China Sea. If they really do want to cooperate, having China, the Philippines, Vietnam, Taiwan, Japan, and then I guess the United States because we have so much presence there, that would make a little bit more sense. And yeah, I think my issue with the Board of Peace is in its writing, and I guess in the notion that's put forward by Donald Trump being chairman for life. But the idea, I guess, like if you put away the participants and the leaders, the idea that certain nations want to come together to solve a problem and not have to deal with the veto nonsense if they took away the power for the chairman for life to veto anything by himself. If they took that away, I thought that would be quite positive. But again, there's so many
So if
different
you just
directions.
stripped the entire thing of its
Yeah.
existence, it would be a positive.
If you have someone that isn't as, I guess, egotistical as Donald Trump write the charter,
Yeah.
then you probably have a better chance at seeing some results.
Well, I also found it very interesting that Steve Witkoff was on the board, I believe, and he has made it very clear, him and Donald Trump both. If you don't know, Steve Witkoff has played a huge role in the Trump corruption thus far. And Steve Witkoff and Donald Trump have basically made it their plan that they want to turn Gaza into a new Vegas strip, just full of their own hotels and real estate. And so the levels of corruption that we see, that this Board of Peace kind of capitulates to as well, is truly mind-blowing. And even when you look at the Trump suing the IRS, you look at Trump taking a $400 million plane from Qatar, a lot of this foreign policy has also been baked into that. How much money can the president make off of it? And at this point, if people are denying the fact that Trump is doing this to enrich himself and those around him, just I really don't know what to say anymore, because it's pretty damn clear. And so, yeah, going back to the UN though, and going back to the Board of Peace, I do think, and I agree with you a lot there, that it should be a lot more focused and it should have an actual form of power to enforce what is agreed upon in those meetings. But anyway, moving on to another part of the Munich conference, we got to see AOC on the world stage for the first time. And it was interesting.
I
because
enjoyed it.
yeah, it was definitely an interesting segment, but she had some good clips, she had some poor clips, and for her first time, you can expect that. But I want to get your overall take on Well, you know what? First, let's roll the clip.
And now I think we are moving in this direction of increased recognition that we have to have a working class centered politics if we are going to succeed, and also if we are going to stave off the scourges of authoritarianism, which also provides political sirens, political siren calls to allure people into finding scapegoats to blame for rising economic inequality, both domestically and globally.
Okay, so that was AOC, and I want to get your thoughts. So let's start with, we'll put aside her answer to Taiwan here in a second, but I want to get your response to what she was talking about with inequality being a leading cause for the rise in authoritarianism that we have seen globally.
Okay. So the first thing I'll say is that I agree with her that there is a dangerous rise of authoritarianism, and I'll also agree with her that democracy should deliver for the working class. In fact, I think it should deliver for everyone. But my main view is I think it's slightly ironic given the kind of policy portfolio that she has. Probably the place where I align the most with, I guess, libertarian views would be on government power. So, as a socialist, as she is, I think that it's counterproductive to say that, or to, I guess, say that the current policy environment is creating a rise in authoritarianism when I and many others believe, and I think it's fact to a certain extent, that when you vest too much power in the central government, as does socialist policies, you create room for authoritarianism to rise. And that's because you put so much power in public institutions that the people in power don't necessarily want to give it away. So when she says here, we have to have a working class centered politics if we are going to succeed, and also we are going to stave off the scourges of authoritarianism, which also provides political siren calls to alert people into finding scapegoats to blame for rising economic inequality, both domestic and globally. I'd say that rather than saying we have a working class centered politics, I say that we just center it based on, well, first thing is you don't necessarily prioritize someone based on their wealth. So I hope that makes sense. But what I'm trying to say here is, while we definitely do have a political system which gives a lot of advantage to the corporations and gives a lot of advantage to the rich and elite, I think additionally, blindly giving the working class, I guess, more empowerment, there has to be some control on that as well. Because it's a firm belief of mine, which will go completely against what AOC advocates for, is that welfare, separating healthcare, welfare should be brought to the point where it's there for people that need it, but we shouldn't necessarily be encouraging people to get to it, if you get what I mean. Like, welfare should be, what we should be prioritizing is getting people to the point where they don't need welfare anymore, rather than having welfare available for everybody where no matter what position you're in, you can go get it. You should be incentivizing people to work harder so that they can provide for themselves rather than having other people or the other taxpayer provide for them. You get what I mean? So in this context, when we look at other nations, a lot of the authoritarian nations we see in the world, they tend to follow a more socialist way of governing. I forgot which dictator. I believe it's Turkmenistan. If you look at Turkmenistan, the party that's been in power since its independence from the Soviet Union is actually just the Turkmenistan Communist Party renamed, or the Turkmenistan Socialist Party. The guy that's in charge was like literally the secretary or whatever they call him of the TSSR, the TSR. So a lot of the policies that carry over, well, I just think it's ironic a little bit coming from someone that believes in huge welfare economies. Not necessarily, I guess differing from the Nordic countries, I guess seizing more of the means of production. I just think it's ironic. And moving forward, I think it's even more ironic for her to talk about benefiting the working class when her big ally in New York City has encountered probably, I think, a problem both of us experienced, or both of us, predicted, which is the big surprise: the socialists ran out of money. Her big ally in New York City, who's pledged to help the working class, wants to raise the property tax by almost 9%. And I don't know exactly all the details. It might be tiered, it might be income based, but that's still a jump. That's still a jump. I don't know exactly how it's going to benefit the working class. So, again, it's one of those things where it's like right, I guess right message, wrong messenger.
Sure. Interesting. I definitely have some agreements there. I have some disagreements. When it comes to welfare, in of itself, I agree that it should be used primarily as a hand up rather than a handout. And, it's interesting because when she talks about having the working class be provided for, I agree with that because as we've seen throughout history, authoritarianism is built on the back of the working class having to fight for their survival rather than being able to fight the government. And so when you see a working class that is thriving, you see them able to and more willing to challenge a government that is growing too big, as you might say. But I also think that you're right in some regards, that her policies don't directly correlate with that. And we've seen socialist countries fail, but we've also seen socialist countries prosper, especially, as you mentioned, the Nordic countries. So I think there's a lot of nuance here, and I think there's a lot of aspects that get left out when we're talking about this. But, and also, sorry, just to kind of go to what you were saying about Zoran Mamdani and the 9% tax, he said that would be necessary if the governor's office did not approve of a wealth tax.
Yeah.
And so I guess, it was more so, I feel like it mostly could be a threat, but he definitely has another goal in mind there. But anyway, going back to AOC and her answer here, I understand where she's coming from. And yes, authoritarianism does rise because the working class is not provided for. But I also do understand what you're saying, in which having too big of a government can also lead to that. But I don't think that that's as much of what we've seen recently as though we have seen. I'm kind of rambling here, but my point is that I do agree with her to a certain extent that when the working class is not provided for, it gives the government more ability and more authority to take however much control they want, because they know that the working class is fighting a completely different battle than the battle that they should be fighting.
So, two things I'll say is that with the Nordic countries, I'm not going to call them socialists because the government doesn't necessarily have any means of production. What they are is they are a welfare state where they do have a private market essentially, but they just heavily tax everybody to where they're able to afford state-provided welfare. But the second thing I'm going to move forward to is when we're talking about the working class not being able to, how to explain this, the government, authoritarianism rises when the government isn't necessarily able to provide for the working class. And what that does is put them in a position where they're fighting for their survival rather than, fighting for their freedom or fighting for et cetera, et cetera. Now, what we provide the working class is just as important. So what I'll say is what democracy needs to provide for the working class, when she says material gains, it doesn't need to directly, how to explain this, democracy itself doesn't need to directly provide wealth gains, property, things like that to the working class. What it needs to do is democracy needs to provide more opportunity for the working class. And in turn, that opportunity should produce more wealth, produce more property, and produce more luxury. So, again, right message, wrong messenger.
Sure. And hold on. I also believe then in that sense that democracy should be delivering a country in which special interests don't control our politics as much as they do, which then leads to the working class not being able to have those exact opportunities that you're talking about. But I also want to, let me give you a specific example there. And I know that the current president has addressed this, which I actually applaud him on, but it's when corporations buy single-family homes. And it's a huge problem, and one that politicians fund in a way, or they fund politicians who then allow them to do this. And it's definitely a problem. But if you also look at what Mamdani has done, which I think is a huge success, is he's given free childcare for all. I know Kamala was proposing a higher child tax credit. Those are good policies, and those help the working class, and they're not direct handouts. They're more so incentives to continue to work and to continue to go based on to continue to contribute to our workforce. So I think that those are positives. But yeah, anyway, we're getting a little far into this. I want to now transition into her, her Taiwan
Yeah, the
answer.
gaff, the big gaff. So
Yeah, and hold on, let me provide some background here. I think it's very important to note, and I said this before, this is her first real time on the world stage. And there is a clear path for her in whether it's 4 years, whether it's 8 years, whether it's 12 years, to one day run for office. She has, or for the president. She has the popularity. Hell, she could probably primary Chuck Schumer in 28 and beat him for the Senate seat. So she has the popularity. But the question is, do gaffes are these going to become the norm for her? Is this something that we should come to expect, or was it just a one-off, first time, nervous, don't have an exact answer? I'll defer to you.
Yeah. Well, what I'll say is, I think I won't hope, but I think that we'll see a little bit more of these gaffes. I think we see them with every politician. There's no perfect politician. So I'm not necessarily going to try to tear apart AOC and call her a failed politician or whatever. What I am going to say is I think it's crucial that any policymaker knows what's going on with China and Taiwan and just how crucial Taiwan is. And again, the reason this surprised me more than anything is because if, the 168-year-old Chuck Schumer doesn't necessarily know about this, I'd understand a little bit more because he's been around for so long in policy that this is what's going on. The importance of Taiwan has increased so much in just the last, 10 years that while he's focused on leading a domestic party, he's probably not paying attention to that many things. But with a younger politician like AOC, who's kind of the beginning of what could either be a dramatic rise or dramatic fall for her, I thought that she would probably be much more equipped to answer a question like this. So to give a little bit more context, I believe that I think this is starting to become a little bit of geopolitical consensus that Taiwan is the single most important island on the world. If China controls it, they'll be the strongest country in the world. If we control it, we continue to hold, our military and technological, superiority over the East. And the reason that is because Taiwan produces the most superior and highest and most efficient quality super chips, and that's what they're called, right? Just super chips. They produce smart chips and things of that nature that many countries have tried to replicate. So China's been trying to replicate it, but they just haven't been able to achieve what Taiwan has. Now, whoever seizes that land, whoever has control, will gain an automatic technological superiority over their adversaries because that technology can be put into almost any sector of a nation. It can go into defense. It can go into domestic technology, consumer goods. It can go into anything. So the issue there is I thought that it would be kind of obvious to say that we would commit U.S. troops to defend Taiwan. But what I'll say is I kind of liked how can I say? I don't like her to the extent she's talking about, but I understand what she's saying about avoiding any such confrontation with China. The reason being, I think we also saw this with Marco Rubio, the Q&A that he had towards the end of his segment at the Munich Security Conference, or at least after his speech, where he said that it's normal to see the United States and China compete. That's always how it's going to be because they're both superpowers. If two superpowers aligned, I don't really know if you can call them superpowers. You know what I mean? The United States and China are going to compete entirely. But like Marco Rubio said, it's important that we still keep diplomacy open to where we're trying to avoid conflict. Because economic conflict is always going to be there. But once it starts to get into actual defense and there's actually people endangered, that's something that we need to avoid at all costs. And we're kind of seeing that. We're seeing a trend towards violent confrontation because of the weaponization of supply chain and trade. But I guess that's kind of a different topic. But her hesitation was, I guess, kind of dangerous for me. And all she can hope for is she just has to patch this up or move forward and just hope that something bigger happens to where people forget about this. She has 2 years, essentially, to get over it. And I think she will. But in my opinion, it was just a shock. I did not think that a sitting policymaker, especially someone as popular as AOC, could make such a big blunder on the global stage. But like you said, it's her first real appearance on the international stage, and I'm not reading into it as much as I think people like. There are some quote unquote pundits that think that this will derail her, whatever popular standing she has. I don't buy that whatsoever, but this was a big blunder, and it's important for her to correct it as quick as we can. And I feel like it's been probably one of the most constant things in American foreign policy ever since the Republic of China fled to Taiwan was we are going to defend that island. And before it was symbolic, but now it's actually crucial to the United States and the West and the West's interests.
Yeah. Well, okay. A lot to unpack there. And there's a lot that I want to touch upon here. But just for AOC herself, I feel like a lot of the chatter and a lot of the, as you said, the pundits, the discourse it's been insane to me in a lot of ways because it makes me laugh a little bit. It was one question and it was one bad answer. In basketball, in football, in any sport, if you make a really big mistake, you watch the tape and you move on. Right? And that's kind of what, if you're AOC, you probably are trying to do. You watch the tape, you understand what went wrong, you learn about the conflict, and then you go do better next time. So that's my big thing. But the bigger picture here, the bigger question is about that, the relations that we have, and whether or not we would commit troops. And as you said, it's a pretty obvious choice. We would commit troops if absolutely necessary, and that's the big part. If it's absolutely necessary, because you do want to avoid that conflict with China. But I think it's also worth noting, I know you brought up a lot of the economic factors there, and I completely agree, but I also think it's a very similar battle as to the Ukraine one, in the sense that you do not want any of the major superpowers in the world to be able to go out and start annexing countries. And obviously we're a little bit guilty of that right now with Greenland, but if China does this, it just signifies more so their global standing, and it could honestly mean that they are taking over as the number one seed. And so if you're the US right now, you have to be doing everything in your power and anything in your power to deter that. But it's also just worth noting that China does want the country. And so at a point, I do think we're going to have to come to terms with the fact that this might not be able to be solved diplomatically. And at the end of the day, just as Vladimir Putin views Ukraine as a part of Russia and not as a sovereign nation, China has that same view towards Taiwan. They don't view them as,
in fact, it's more
as
radical.
we view them. It's more radical. It's far more radical.
It's far more radical than Russia.
Exactly. And that's the scary part. It's how can you convince a superpower that has the means and the will to do something to not do it because it's in your personal interest for that not to happen. So there's a lot of factors that go into play here. But specifically for AOC, it's a blunder. It's a mistake. The reason I brought it up in the first place was just because of the online attention that it got. But anyway, complete 180 here. I want to dive into the last big part of Munich, and it was what's been a big part for the last 4 years. It's been the Ukraine and Russia war. Just before the conference, or at the conference, I'm going to just quote this: Western intelligence and military officials revealed their latest estimate of Russian casualties, 65,000 over the course of December and January, which is about 1,000 per day. The Russians have only gained about 12% of Ukraine since the full-scale invasion in 2022. So we're going to start with you again. What exactly do you think is the end game here? I know that Zelensky talked about, and we can roll that clip. Actually, let's just roll the clip.
Give us 2 months of ceasefire, we will go to elections. That's it. give us ceasefire, give us security infrastructure. Maybe not 2 months, but we need a lot of days to prepare. Then give us possibility, our soldiers, to vote, how they can, defend our lives, our country, and at the same moment to vote. This is something difficult.
So, I would want to, let's hear your perspective on that.
I mean, funny enough, I guess Ukraine has been one of the things I haven't been as touched up on. But what I get, I saw that Ukraine has been making advances, actually, or at least pushing back Russia quite a bit. But I guess the end game here is try to get to a point. Well, here's the thing. It's difficult to say especially with who's in the White House right now. You never know exactly what the end game is. But for Ukraine, or I guess for us, what I'll say is, when you look at Trump's perspective, this isn't necessarily the end game. This is my prediction for what will happen. Trump will do anything that can get his name somewhere important. You know what I mean? So, kind of using trade as an example here. When we talk about the EU and India making a trade deal, in my opinion, both sides kind of pulled a masterstroke in their diplomatic approach, where what they did was, okay, Trump's not budging on these tariffs. We're going to negotiate with another partner, which he put major tariffs on, which is India, and we're going to come to the table, we're going to reach an agreement, and we're going to go out and call it something fancy, like the mother of all trades. So we do that. And then what both sides have done essentially is they've achieved. Then they see that Trump is, I guess, trying to get in on it, on this glory. They reach a deal, and all they have to do to get Trump to, I guess, get over it is allow him to claim victory. So, what I'm expecting from the United States with the Ukraine conflict is, let's say there's going to be a temporary ceasefire. Let's say we get to a temporary ceasefire. I think Russia's hope is that, I don't really know. Do you think Zelensky would win an election? Probably.
Absolutely.
Yeah, he's a wartime president. But if, I guess it depends. If Russia thinks that they can, get in there, and I guess if Zelensky lose, then yeah, maybe they'll agree to a temporary ceasefire to where Trump can go out and say that he established peace in the region. Or the conflict continues until Trump gets to the point where either he gives up on peace, and I doubt he'll start sending weapons, but he's going to try all these things. He's going to try all these different things to try to get his name out there. And I honestly don't know if I'm going to ask you here because I don't really know as much about the topic, but I really don't know if we see a true end to this conflict until number 48 comes into office.
I am just shocked that the recipient of the FIBA Peace Prize and the hand-me-down Nobel Peace Prize was unable to stop this war before he even got into office. Anyway, I digress. Going to what you're saying, though, it is very interesting. And you're right, I don't either see a solution to this until the next president takes office. But I also think that if you're Russia at this point, you're not going to back down because of all the might you've put into this and just the signal that it would send. And if that means that their conscription process ends up in Moscow, or it could take over the entire country and they could draft every single Russian to go fight. But they clearly don't care about a terrible economy, a terrible morale in the country. They don't care about that stuff. They care about their power because Putin knows that his seat is secure. And so I think when you look at this conflict overall, a lot of people point to it being a problem with NATO, and that Putin has this big problem with NATO being invited, or with Ukraine being invited into NATO. And I push back on that. I don't believe that that is the root cause of this. I think it is more so the fear that Vladimir Putin has of democracy spreading into Russia. And we saw that numerous times throughout the color revolutions in Eastern Europe, and we've seen his response to it. We've seen how he really just hates democracy, and he hates the idea of losing his power. And that was one of the main things that we saw in 2014. We saw the overthrowing of the pro-Russian president in Ukraine, and that's exactly when he started invading Crimea. So I think that there's a lot of things that we can look at U.S. foreign policy-wise that went wrong, and I'm not afraid to criticize Obama there, and I'm going to just say this: Joe Biden's criticized Obama on this, but just for Russia itself, Vladimir Putin's fear is not NATO. So that's why my personal end to this war is allowing Ukraine into NATO, because once that is secure, this war is over. And I don't think at this point that Russia has, and actually, no, I know that Russia does not have the military or economic might to fight the entirety of NATO. So if you let Ukraine into the alliance, this war will be over, and we will send a message to the rest of the world that we are actually going to achieve peace through strength. It's a phrase that Donald Trump and his administration have been using. This is the actual way to go about that.
Yeah, kind of jumping in there, I'd say the one thing for Putin, I think when he first got into this conflict, he, of course, at first he probably thought he can get a strategic, like a quick and easy win, take Kyiv, and, kind of move on from the conflict quick. However, obviously he saw that the conflict or the invasion was taking a lot longer than projected. Kind of reminded me a little bit of when Germany in 1914 thought that they can take Paris in 2-3 months or whatever, and it didn't work. But kind of the big defeat for Russia, which I feel like nobody really talks about, but it's kind of touched upon in a few books I've been reading. I think this is probably the biggest thing that's been ignored, is Finland joining NATO. Finland stayed neutral and non-aligned for a very, very long time. They didn't like to get involved. They traded with the West. It's clear they're a little bit more Western aligned, but they never liked to actually interject in conflict because of their border with Russia. However, in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Finland became the 31st member of NATO in 2023. And there's a few things you have to consider with Finland joining NATO. So, one of the biggest things in World War II, when Hitler and Stalin signed an agreement where they would split Poland and they had a non-aggression pact, the USSR took the opportunity to not only annex the Baltics, they additionally invaded Finland. They thought that they can defeat Finland quick. However, the Soviets, I guess, early military inaptitude was put on, it was shown completely to the world. And the key things with Finland is that by joining NATO, NATO's border with Russia expanded. It lengthened. I think it doubled, nearly doubled. And you might be thinking that's bad for NATO because that's more, Russia has such a huge army, they can just steamroll, blah, blah, blah. The problem with that is Finland is really, really close to St. Petersburg. That is, and it is a historically important, culturally significant, and strategically vital city to Russia. 5% of its GDP is produced in St. Petersburg. So when you look at that, already when you talk about, I guess, the geopolitical strategy for NATO when it came to Russia, and then when you move forward to the war strategy, Kaliningrad is obviously isolated. But now, if NATO was to station, let's say, a concentrated force in Finland, they can immediately threaten Russia's second most important city. So what Putin probably realized from that when Finland joined was that of course the population isn't able to do anything. He suppresses his population. But the actual intellectuals in Russia would see that Putin's losing some of his geopolitical grip. So what he's aiming to do is he has to get an all-out victory in Ukraine so that he can keep the intellectuals and the generals on his side. We saw for the first time in modern Russian history, or I guess in Putin Russian history, is you saw what's his name, the Wagner guy, Prigozhin. You saw Prigozhin openly rebel against Putin, which is something that was almost unheard of just, I guess, 10 years ago. So my thought there, and I completely agree with you, is Ukraine joining NATO would kind of seal the deal. And to anyone who actually believes that NATO or the West provoked Russia by inviting Ukraine to join NATO or whatever, put a sock in it, man. Like just, read any book about the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and you realize that no matter what, Russia would want Ukraine. Like it has nothing to do with NATO. They're not threatened. Russia has wanted Ukraine back ever since Putin. You forget Putin. People forget Putin was a former KGB spy. He used to work in the Soviet government, and the Soviets, at least the hardliners, were furious that why am I forgetting his name? That Yeltsin could go behind Gorbachev's back and make a deal with Ukraine and Belarus, and Russia loses what they view as a quote unquote integral part of their territory. And well, yeah, I guess to sum it up, I completely agree with you. It was a huge disaster for Vladimir Putin, and NATO having Ukraine join would just completely seal the deal.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And it's funny, if you actually go back and look at what Putin said when he was first rising into power, he actually was very favorable towards NATO. And he even opened the door to the possibility of Russia one day joining the alliance, which is, I know I've talked to you about that before. Insane, by the way. But we are approaching that 1 hour mark here, so I want to take another hard pivot and let's get to the conflict that has been pretty much front and center over the past couple weeks, and that has been the Trump administration and Iran. So we've seen protests in Iran a lot recently, and Donald Trump drew this hard line telling the country to stop suppressing the protesters, and well, they did not stop, and Donald Trump didn't do anything. But now we have seen, now we've seen these nuclear negotiations, and we've seen a more willingness from Trump to engage in military action in Iran, and we've seen the possibility of a war breaking out between the two countries. And as we release this video, there is a very real possibility that this war could have already started. So we're definitely talking as of February 22nd. So I'm going to kick it over to you here to get us started on this.
Yeah. How do I put it this way? I am obviously... So first thing is, if we were really supporting the protesters of Iran, then that's one thing. I guess in my opinion, the people of Iran have been long oppressed by the so-called Islamic Republic. They've suffered. The true Persian identity has started to disappear. They've eroded some of the native groups, like the Zoroastrians. I'm a little more familiar with that because they immigrated to, I guess, my ancestral homeland. But the thing there is, to what extent do we want to intervene? Because if we're talking about a regional war, well, first thing I'll put aside is I don't believe that we'd make an Iraq-level mistake just because warfare has evolved so much in the last 20 years. I'd say that this war would be a lot more focused on economics, cyber warfare, and I'd estimate concentrated military force in strategic areas rather than in Iraq. Because the difference here is I think that there is a lot more to go off of to justify an invasion of Iran versus justifying a war in Iraq where you didn't actually have any real evidence of weapons of mass destruction. So that's one thing. And then, of course, the easy part, and I forgot which American official it was, or I would be surprised if it wasn't an American. Winning the war is the easy part. It's what you do after the war. That's what's going to be difficult. So what do you want, or what would you want? Let's say we do enter this war. What would you want the end result to be, and what would you want the United States to do if it came to, I guess, establishing a regime or doing whatever they want in Iran?
Yeah, it's really tough, and I don't exactly have an answer for you because I'm not fully in favor of the war. It's very difficult in some ways because I 100% support the protesters and I 100% support the people of Iran. But the real problem is regime change has just never worked out. Hell, we've tried that just recently in Venezuela and there's been no change. It's just the vice president took over. There's no changes there. If you were to look at the country before Maduro was captured and after, nothing has changed. The U.S. doesn't control anything. The only difference is they don't have their president. So we just have a really bad precedent when it comes to regime change. And if you were to
President or
appoint
precedent?
Precedent. We have a bad president too. Precedent.
Okay, precedent. Okay,
Yes. Sorry. Yeah. I don't really trust us to back a group, and there's a lot to be figured out here. But
Well-
I guess the bigger question is, how exactly do you go about that regime change? Are you putting troops on the ground? Are you
So what
are you
I'd
doing it?
say-
Because you're not going to go in and take the president, or you're not going to go in and take the supreme leader just like you
Yeah.
did to Maduro.
I think one thing is our biggest mistake in Iraq was, how do I put this? In Iraq, there was a much bigger divide between the Sunni and Shia population. And what we did was we installed a pretty unpopular Shia regime. The difference in Iran is I don't think the division along religious lines, how do I explain this? The difference along religious lines isn't as severe because I think the population is majority Shia or not Muslim. How do I explain this? It's there's Shia and then there'll be a minority of Sunnis and then, non-Muslim, I guess. So, additionally, again, I'm not the biggest fan of him, and I think he's, I guess, just a Western puppet. But Reza Pahlavi, the son of the Shah, I believe he recommended something like a parliamentary democracy or something like that. The instability, that's the thing with regime changes. Dealing with the immediate instability is going to be really difficult, especially in a place like Iran, which is very mountainous. There's the terrain is not very easy to navigate, and I'm guessing we don't really. I mean, our troops don't know too much about the land. I just don't see a efficient way to go about this. Unless we guarantee, I guess, self-determination for the Iranian people,
Which is hard, by the way. It's a very difficult task,
especially
because
coming out of a regime change.
Well, exactly, and that's what I wanted to quickly put some context on. Marco Rubio has said that the potential successor would most likely come from within the regime. And so you really have to then question, A, are they aligned with Western values? Are they aligned with the values of the current administration? Or are they just going to be more of the same? Because that's the last thing that you want. If you go through this entire thing, potentially lose U.S. troops for there to be no real change.
Well, what I'll say is there is a faction within Iran, even the current regime, which understands that the supreme leader, the Ayatollah, he's outdated. They're living in a, I guess, still Cold War mentality. They haven't
How old is he?
necessarily.
86?
He's ancient, and they haven't really, I guess, modernized, or with modernizing, they haven't really, I don't know how to say moderatized. Like, they haven't really gotten more moderate. And there's a bloc that definitely believes that. I would expect within the regime, if there was a leader, somebody who's already within the regime to take office or take leadership, I'd guess that there would be kind of a removal of the supreme leader role. And then probably heavy restrictions on nuclear and military capabilities. But, I guess it's important to throw around the I word a little bit. And, kind of explain how Israel ties into this. Because you're talking about a major shift in geopolitics in the region. I would guess there'd be a lot related to Iranian funds going to Hamas. A lot of discussion about Hezbollah, and a lot of discussion about the Houthis. I guess out of the three, the Houthis are probably the strongest group. But what I would hope is if we came to an agreement where they stopped backing the Houthis as heavily, we can stop giving our missiles to Saudi Arabia to bomb children's buses. I think we should stop doing that regardless. But
Would help if the president's not taking billions of dollars from them, but
Yeah, it's just there's a lot that plays into it. It's a very complex region. There's cultural differences, there's religious differences. There's so many billionaires that kind of pull the strings in the region. You have oil, which means that America's always going to be around. And I mean, we'll really see, because it's hard to determine an outcome or a wanted outcome when we don't know exactly what's going to happen. We don't necessarily have an indication, and we're kind of at the point where that's what I think is interesting about war in 2026 is, it's not just going to be troops marching in columns into the countryside. You don't know how it's going to start. Will there be, probably be preemptive airstrikes or missiles? And you don't know, are they going to concentrate on military installations and, kidnap the supreme leader? Or are they actually going to put boots on the ground to the point where we're looking at Western advancements? And what allies are going to play into this? Will it just be the United States? I doubt there'll be much European participation. But who knows? I mean, if they find a rationale in what they think is supporting the protesters, then who knows? Like, it could go either way.
Yeah, well, I think that there's three main focuses that Trump could take here if he does decide to pursue military action. The first one would be that he simply uses it as leverage for nuclear negotiations. And I guess that would be one of the most beneficial to Americans overall. The second one would be that he actually goes in and tries to put some regime change in place, and that also does include potentially killing or capturing the Ayatollah. And the third would be that it's just a symbolic airstrike, and it's something that would then be you would see a proportionate response from Iran, so probably nothing crazy, but it would mostly be symbolic to say, hey, look, I put a red line, I followed through on that red line, let's move on. Like, I don't care about this. Those are his three real options at this point. So I'm going to ask you, knowing what you do about how Iran has treated the protesters and everything that's going on there, how would you proceed? Would you even pursue military action, or would you take more of an isolationist stance on this?
Unfortunately, the protesters aren't the only thing that you have to factor in, because...
Sure, factor in the nuclear agreements as well.
Factor in the nuclear agreements, and then factor in the I word. Those
is
two
like
aspects...
a banned word or something?
No. It says, when you factor... I just like saying that. When you factor in Israel to the equation as well, you kind of have to look at... And then factor in all the other conflicts. Factor in Lebanon, factor in Yemen, factor in Syria. What exactly what are all the implications of what we're doing? Additionally, what will the response from the East be? I feel like it's been really weird that I feel like we haven't seen, maybe I'm missing something, much from Russia or China, who are supposed to be some of Iran's biggest allies.
Well, Russia's a little bit preoccupied right now.
Yeah, I mean, I understand
Also,
Russia.
they're supposed to be allies of Venezuela. They didn't do anything.
So, I mean, again, maybe there's an agreement that was made about Ukraine or something like that. But again, you never know. I guess the only approach I can take, because we don't necessarily know all the implications, is kind of my approach to everything, which is if you're going to do something, make sure it's efficient and it doesn't cost the American taxpayer or the American person too much. And more than anything, I really wish this could be solved without any American soldiers being put on the ground or endangering any American soldiers or American lives. But, I mean, to what extent are we willing to go to get the desired result? And what is the desired result? The Supreme Leader just got unlucky that there's protesters, because if there weren't protesters, we probably wouldn't do anything, because now that's going to be our rationale for it. Yeah. And we'll see.
Well, I also think it's worth noting that the reason that we don't have an actual nuclear agreement in place right now is because in his first term, Trump repealed the JCPOA. And you can find faults with the agreement, but at the end of the day, it was an agreement,
Yeah,
and that's super important to note. But I also just want to go into this a little bit, because I know you're mentioning allies and the role that they're going to play. The UAE and Saudi Arabia have already publicly said that the United States cannot use their airspace for attacks. So I think that's interesting. And, you know, a lot of it at this point has to do with what are you willing to give up? For what goal? And if your goal is to have a strong nuclear agreement in place, there are steps that you have to then take to get there. And one of those main steps is probably going to be then in some way impacting the current regime, because the current regime seems a lot more equipped and a lot more willing to take on military strikes rather than strikes on their nuclear arsenal. And we saw it last year as well during, what was it, a 12-day war? We saw the Trump administration go and bomb certain regions or certain areas where they believed the nuclear arsenal was being held. And it was interesting in the fact that he announced that he was doing it before he did it. So some reports, and has it been verified if they actually struck anything?
So it's verified, but the extent of the damage, like you have J.D. Vance going out there saying that we destroyed everything.
That's not true.
The, I guess, expert, quote unquote, expert analysis, and what are they called? There's like an atomic commission. I forgot what they're called, but I guess they ruled that Iran's programs would be up and running again in another 6 to 9 months.
Yeah.
But you know, like you said, it's more about what are we giving up for what. And I guess there's a couple regional things that we can tie in. What if, I mean, you know, Saudi Arabia and Qatar are saying no to using their airspace. What if Pakistan would get into an agreement? What if you know, you see that they're conducting airstrikes against the Taliban right now as we speak. Who knows, you know, if they come to an agreement about something like that. Or, you know, we already know that with or without Saudi Arabia and Qatar, we have aircraft carriers. And, you know, we're America, so we can probably reach them. But
second to none.
Yeah, again, like you don't necessarily know what extent our operation is going to be. And at the end of the day, I really wish this could be solved diplomatically, like always. But my desired outcome is, with Iran gone, Israel can stop. We can stop giving money to Israel, with the expectation that, you know, why do you need this? Iran's gone. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because Iraq's already gone. Iraq's gone. Syria's pretty much gone. Egypt is like pretty reliant on American trade, and I mean, with Iran gone, you don't necessarily have a major regional player that's there to threaten Israel's existence.
Well,
you never know, but
two things there. Number one is that I still feel like a lot of Trump's plan is based off of what Israel plans. And we've seen this. He's a big supporter of Israel. And the Republican Party as a whole is still a big supporter of Israel. If you want to talk about how much AIPAC plays into that, we can talk about that later time. But at the end of the day, Republican priorities and this current administration's priorities are still aligned with Israel. How Israel is on the board of peace. They weren't allowed in Munich. Or was it Munich? I don't know. Wherever they held some council, or the first meeting, Israel wasn't allowed to be there because Benjamin Netanyahu would have been arrested. It's worth noting that.
Yeah, it was Davos. It was Davos. World Economic Forum.
Yeah, that's right. Sorry, I'm a little off point there. I'm just kind of ranting about Israel. But either way, Netanyahu has been very clear for 20 years at this point that he wants the U.S. to continue to strike Iran, and he has been very clear that Iran has this huge nuclear arsenal that threatens Israel's existence. And so Israel would clearly have a role to play in any type of strikes against Iran. But then the last thing I want to point out is American public perception, because that definitely would weigh on Donald Trump. I think right now it's about 70% of Americans oppose any form of military intervention into Iran. And so if, let's just say, Donald Trump does carry this out and gets heavy pushback from the American public, from editorials, from think tanks, what happens to his plan if his approvals go down into the 30s or into the 20s because of this. I don't know, again, going back to what's the goal, I don't know if the means then justify the ends. Or opposite, whatever. You get what I'm saying.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's just something worth noting, and it's something that's very interesting playing out on the world stage right now. But as I said, as we release this episode, the U.S. could have already struck Iran. I know that Trump has his State of the Union on Tuesday, so it would be very interesting if he were to announce that we are engaging in military
kinetic
conflict.
action, as they say.
Kinetic action with Iran. But, all right, foreign policy episode. It's always fun. And we were recording this on the last day of the Olympics. Quick thoughts from you.
You know what? I didn't watch it.
Well,
but I saw the
that is
Jack
great.
Hughes goal. That was cool. And
that was really awesome.
I saw that what was it? Trudeau, I don't know if this is even real. Trudeau tweeted in like 2025 like you can't take our land and you can't take our state or something. And
That for the Four Nations tournament.
Yeah, was it I don't know, was it like the White House responded like with the bald eagle? That was funny.
I will say, here in California, the game was at 5 a.m. I woke up for it. One of the best games of hockey I've ever watched. Super fun. I was hyped in bed. It was awesome right there. It was awesome, dude.
You know, one thing I want to add, and like I guess the viewers will kind of get a hint to where we're going next. But for GW, you can get free admission. They play. Sometimes they play right after the Capitals. In the same place, and you can get free admission to the GW game if you go to the Capitals game. So I mean, again, I don't know if I can sit through 4 hours of hockey, but
Where do you think we're going to college?
Huh?
Just because you kind of just dropped in that we're going to GW next year.
Oh yeah. We're going to GW. Everyone.
News, bit of news. Okay.
Also, one thing I love about hockey is
yeah.
I like how they can fight and it's allowed. That's my favorite part.
Dude, okay, but that's the worst part about the Olympics is that they don't let them drop their gloves.
Oh, actually?
It's awful. I mean, the Four Nations tournament.
Yeah, wasn't it like right at the tip? Yeah,
right at puck drop.
There was like 3
right
fights.
at puck drop. These people just drop their gloves and start going at it. Anyway, last thing before we end this episode. Kash Patel.
Is
partying with Team USA right after the game. American taxpayer dollars are
that's the most
well
American
at work right
thing,
now.
baby. Yes, sir.
Yup.
Yes, sir.
Right. There. Anyway, that's going to be all for today. Thank you guys for listening. We're out. Peace.